Hey everyone, in this video we're going to continue working on the materials and we're going to get to a pretty cool end result which looks really similar to the Bruno Simon portfolio website. We're going to add some additional leva properties right here, and initially you won't see any objects on the scene anymore because we now have this reveal progress property that when you increase it you'll see that it slowly starts to show the objects, just as when you click to press the start button in the original website. We're also going to add that for the shadow alpha, so we don't have any shadow. We didn't have any shadow in the previous video, but we're going to add that in this video as well, so that you can add that here. We can change the color of it to any color you want. And we're going to add support for indirect lights, which is the light that bounces via the floor onto the objects. So you can see that the objects are slightly orange right here, so we're going to add support for that as well. You can also change that color, and you can change the values to make it even stronger, or yeah, whatever you want to do with it. Awesome, let's get started. Okay, so last video we added the FolioMatCapMaterials to the static objects, but we haven't been able to add the FloorShadowMaterials and the Mesh Basic materials to the other objects yet. Now in this scene we only need a FloorShadowMaterial, but we're also going to add the Mesh Basic materials just to prepare for the future videos. Now you might be wondering why we even need this floor, because we already have the orange floor in the background and that already looked good, and that is because of shadows. So if I will show you the original website, you'll see that for example, the trees, they have a clear shadow right here, and ours don't have that yet. So this floor is going to be invisible mostly, except for those parts there. It's going to show a little bit of shadow. And of course, this shadow also applies to any other static object. Okay, so let's get started. Let's look into the code that Bruno wrote for this. So if we go to the world folder inside of objects.js, we have a set parser function right here, and inside of there we also checked for the FolioMatCapMaterial. If the object name starts with shade, then we're going to apply the FolioMatCapMaterial. But in our case we're now going to check the floor. So if the child name starts with floor, then we're going to apply the FloorShadowMaterial. But there's one additional catch here, and that is that it's creating the floor manually because of missing UVs. Now this is needed probably because the export settings didn't include the UVs. So Bruno Simon probably decided to not include those because he doesn't need the UVs for any of the objects except for the plane on the floor. So he probably decided to just create that one manually to lower the size of the file. Now let's start implementing this ourselves, and to start with that we will first need to convert the FloorShadow function to a FloorShadowMaterial class. This one is quite easy, so I'm going to copy it, rename it to FloorShadowMaterial.ts, and instead of exporting a default function we're going to export a class called FloorShadowMaterial, and it's going to extend the shader material from 3, and all the rest of the code can be part of the constructor. Now we don't need to return the material anymore, and we need to call the super with the uniforms in there, or actually all the options that we previously passed to the shader material. And there we go, that's everything actually. Now we're currently setting the uniforms to null, but that doesn't make much sense because we'll need them anyways if we want to use this material. So let's just make them mandatory and expect a texture and a color inside of the constructor parameters, so that whenever you create one of the FloorShadow materials you will have to pass those. Same for the string, for color, sorry. And let's pass those to the uniforms right here. Now the color needs to be a new color, of course, because that's what the shader expects. I will need to convert that from linear to sRGB, as we did before in this series. Now the U alpha I'm going to set to 1 for now, and we're going to change that later. Okay, so next we can go to the hook, the useGetMaterial hook that we created before. And what we did before was check if there is a matcap, or if the object needs a matcap material. And this time we're just gonna have to do something similar, but then check if it needs a FloorShadowMaterial. And for that I created an additional function, isFloor. Now this time we actually don't need to get a color like we did with the matcap, because we only have to check if it's a floor, and we don't need any color from it. And this regex is just based on the code of Bruno Simon himself. So now we can add this here, check if it is a floor based on the mesh name, and in that case we return a FloorShadowMaterial. Now we're going to run into an issue here because this FloorShadowMaterial expects a texture as we just specified, but we don't have access to that texture right here. And we also cannot get access to it in the root of our hook because we don't know which floor shadow we want to get yet, because that depends on the mesh, so we only know that inside of this function. Because for example the floor shadow from this section is different than the floor shadow from a different section. Now the way we previously solved that with the matte captures is by just getting all of the matte captures and then in here just picking the one of a specific color. So yeah, you might think we can do the same here. We're just gonna get all the floor shadows and then just pick the one from our current section, but that's actually not possible because we don't have a unique identifier as we have with the color, where we know that gray is a gray matte cap, that we need a gray matte cap there. We don't have that here, so the way we're going to do it is we're going to pass the texture to the getMaterial function right here. So let's call that floor shadow texture type texture and pass that into here, and as the second argument we need to specify the color. Let's make that black for now. Now this is giving us a black plane as a result, and that's because we are not setting the floor shadow texture yet when we're using this, and that's inside of the folio model component. So let's actually get the FloorShadowMaterial here texture using the useTexture hook, and the floor shadow differs for every model, yeah, as mentioned before, so we're gonna have to pass it here as well. And let's call it floor shadow path here, type string. So we have access in it here and pass it to the useTexture hook, and now we have access to it. We can pass that as the second argument in getMaterial. And now we only need to do one more thing, and that is adding the actual path to the intro section component. So in here this one's complaining currently, so let's add the floor shadow path, and we're going to set that to the floor shadow inside of models, intro, static, and here we have it, FloorShadow.png. It looks like this, and you might recognize the position of the trees and the stones and the shadow that comes from it, and that's the one we're going to load in and add to the plane. So that's inside of models, intro, static, FloorShadow.png. Now let's reload, and as you see it's still not there, and that is because of that one issue that I mentioned before about the missing UVs. So we're going to add that now, and we'll need to do that somewhere where we have access to the actual mesh, and that is inside of the folio model component. Right here we have access to the mesh, and here we're gonna have to set the geometry to a new plane geometry, just as Bruno Simon did, and we're gonna have to check if it's a floor here as well. Now we already have that function available in the useGetMaterial, so let's export it from there so we can use it in folio model as well. So if it's a floor, then let's set the geometry to a new plane geometry. Now save this, and there you go, you see the shadows right away. Now they are currently a bit too strong, and we're gonna look into that, but let's first focus on the last type of materials, and that is the pures or the mesh basic materials. How Bruno did this, it's really straightforward. It's as similar as the other two. He just checks if the child name starts with pure, and then he's setting the material. There are no catches here or anything. So let's do that as well. But first let's check the materials file to see which colors Bruno uses. And that are those three, red, white and yellow, with those colors. And they're all three mesh basic materials. So let's do the same in our useGetMaterial hook. On the top I'm going to create a new object. I'll copy that over. It's the basic material colors object with those colors. And then inside of our getMaterial function we're gonna have to check if we need to apply a mesh basic material, and then we're going to set that. Now I'll copy over the function for that as well. Get basic color, it's basically the same as getMatCapColor, but instead it checks for if the name starts with pure, and only then it returns the string, otherwise it's going to be undefined. So first let's check if it has a pure color, and if so, then let's return a new mesh basic material. We're going to set the color to the basic material colors, and then we're going to get the property pure color. So in case it's red, for example, we're going to get this value right here. And now TypeScript is still complaining about one more thing, and that is that it's trying to get any string property from the basic material colors, while we know that basic material colors only has a red, white and yellow property, and pure color can be any string. So let's say that pure color is brown, for example, a different color. Since it can be any string, it can also be that. TypeScript doesn't know which kind of string it currently is. So then it would pick brown from the basic material colors, which doesn't exist, and that's why it's complaining right here. So basically what we're gonna have to do is set the pure color to one of those three values. So let's narrow this type down by getting the three keys out of this object. And the way to do that is by using key off. Now you cannot specify a value here, you need to specify a type. But we didn't specify the type for this basic material colors. But we can get the type just by using type off, and then specifying the value. And let's set that to the type basic material color. And as you'll see, this returns either red, white or yellow. So it's one of those, and if we add a new color here, it will automatically be added there as well. Now let's return that inside of our getBasicColor function instead of a string, or of course undefined in case we don't want to apply a basic color to the mesh. And then we'll have to cast it here as well, because this could still be a string before, but we know that it's not. Alright. So now if you check the pure color right here, you'll see that it can be either red, white, yellow or undefined. And since we check if it's undefined or not right here, we will be sure that that color exists. Now let's get started with the most fun part of this video, and that is tweaking all the values of the materials that we have. And that is more than actually only the shadow that we see here, the shadow color. There are also some uniforms that we can tweak, and you'll see the result soon. But let's get started with the floor shadow, since that one's quite obvious. So let's add a floor shadow color that we're going to retrieve from use controls from leva. So let's copy that over and set the default value to the value that Bruno uses as well, and that's actually not completely black. So if you go to materials, you'll see that in the set floor shadow he's using this color. So let's copy that one over as the default value, and let's give it a label just to make it a little bit more clear. Floor shadow color. And then we can use this value instead of the black one. Now save this and refresh. We'll actually need to go to #leva. Now if you change this color, it will actually not work currently, because this function does get updated, so it will return the new shadow color. But we're actually in the folio model, we're only updating the scene once on the initial render because of the empty dependency array. But actually, when the getMaterial function gets updated, we want to rerun this so that the shadow gets updated as well. If we save this, you'll see now we can change the shadow to any color we want. Awesome. Now there's one more value in the FloorShadowMaterial that we just set to 1 right now, but we want to make that tweakable as well, and that's the alpha. So how strong is this, or how opaque is this shadow going to be? Currently it's 1, but I think it would be nice if we can set it a default color and then later on update it. So let's set the alpha like this, by passing a number, and save it. Then we'll have to update it here as well. So let's set that to FloorShadow Alpha and add that to the use control sook right here. So that's going to be a new property with a default value of 0 actually, because by default we don't want to see the shadow. If you remember correctly, you'll see that here there is no shadow yet, and we only want to display it once start gets clicked. Like the shadow starts to appear right now. So we're going to do that as well. And let's give it a label. FloorShadow Alpha. And actually a minimum and a maximum. 0 and 1. And now if we update this value, then you'll see that the shadow gets updated as well. Awesome. Now we can start doing the same for the FolioMatCapMaterial, but first I'd like to slightly update the way we're using leva. I want to add a folder to make it a little bit more organized, so that we have everything related to materials in one folder, because later on we're going to add other folders as well. And the way we can do that is just by specifying a first string and call that materials, and this way we'll get added in there. But what I really like to do as well is give it an icon. So with Windows key dot for Windows, I'm not sure how to do it on Apple. You can add an emoji. There we go. And I'd like to give it a color and collapse it by default. So let's set collapse to true and give it a color of this specific value, which is the color of the yellow spark that you see on the emoji itself. Now I want to add those two values to the floor folder, and I want to add this floor folder inside of the materials folder because it's also a material. So let's first go to that floor component right here, and instead of passing floor as the first argument, we're gonna pass that materials as well. And then instead of directly passing the values here, we're going to pass an object first with the floor as a key and a folder as a value, and in that folder we're gonna pass this object like this, and this way it will get added into that folder as well. So this way you can make nested folders. Now actually I want to do the same here. Let's make it collapsed by default, because we're going to get a lot more later on. And I want to give this a color as well, and that's going to be this value. And let's actually also give this a emoji, but we can only do that by wrapping this in brackets like this. So here we can add this brick emoji, and there we go. There it is. Now let's slightly change the labels right here because they're quite unreadable. And there we go, labels for all 4 of the colors. And let's move those to Floor Shadow Alpha and color properties over from the materials folder into the floor folder as well. So let's add that object again, give it the same property name, like this, and then the value is going to be a folder again, and we're going to pass in that object. Also here, let's collapse it and give it that same color. Now, as you might see, we're kind of repeating something here, such as the title and the color. So let's actually refactor that so that we have it all in one place and we don't have to repeat it. So for that, I'm going to create a constant file in the JavaScript folder, and I'll copy over the exact value. This is just the same as we already saw before, but then inside of one object with the color in there as well. So instead of using that value here, that hard-coded value, we're going to use the label from that constant. And we're going to do the same for the floor. And change the color to floor.color and materials.color. And that should give us the same result. Now we only still need to do this for the floor component as well. And there we go. Now currently the name floor shadow color is not really needed. We can just change that to shadow color since it's inside of the floor folder. So let's do that. And that's everything we're gonna do for now. Okay, so let's now finally start tweaking the FolioMatCapMaterial. For that, we're gonna have to change the material itself first, because currently they are just hard-coded values. We need to be able to pass them right here. So we're gonna allow a second argument, and I'm going to make that an object, so that we're not gonna have a lot of parameters in this constructor. And let's start with the reveal progress, which is the first uniform right here. And let's set the type of this argument to FolioMatCapMaterial uniforms, and make that an interface right before here. Whoops. So reveal progress is going to be a number, and let's set that value right here. Okay, now we're gonna have to pass that in here. Previous value was a 1, so let's set it back to that and see if everything still works. Yes. Now if we change this to 0, you'll see that it disappears. But if we change it to 0.3, for example, you'll see that it starts to appear. And this is the same as what you see in the animation when the start button gets clicked and the objects are appearing on the screen. So we're going to make this tweakable as well, so you can see it more clearly. So inside of the materials folder, we're going to have a separate property right here. I won't add this into a specific folder because I think it's quite a unique property. So let's just add the reveal progress right away instead of adding it into a folder, and give it a default value of 0 and a maximum of 1 and actually a minimum of 0. And let's also add a label again. Alright, now we can get this value right here and pass that along. Save it. And as you'll see, it doesn't appear anymore by default because the reveal progress is 0. Now if we change it up, there it is. Exactly as when you press the start button. Of course, we're now only doing this in debug mode, but later on we're also going to animate this so that when you click on the start button, it automatically goes from 0 to 1. And then we still have a bunch of other uniforms in the FolioMatCapMaterial that we are going to make tweakable as well. But I'll fast forward this and explain it at the end. Alright, now that was quite a bit of code, but it was pretty straightforward and quite similar to what we did before, so that's why I fast forwarded it. So what I added is the tweakable values for everything regarding indirect lights. As you see, those are all related to that. So I added a folder for that in leva, actually in the leva folders constant called indirect light. I gave it a color, and then I gave it the values that we previously set inside of the material itself. I now set those here, and I gave it a label. Did that for every property and passed those together into the second argument of the FolioMatCapMaterial. And I retrieved them by just taking all the rest of the object. So not the floor shadow and the floor shadow alpha. Sorry, not the floor shadow color and the floor shadow alpha, because we already destructured those from the object that gets returned, but actually all the other uniforms. And I think you can actually see the structure right here. Those are all the uniforms for the MatCapMaterial. And the result is the following: a list of new tweakable properties. And the indirect light is actually doing the following. It's giving you some kind of like reflection on the objects, on all the MatCapMaterial objects, which is quite subtle actually. If you go to the official website, you'll see that here it has a little bit of an orange tint that comes off from the floor onto the object, and to refresh, you'll see that with the default values, once we increase the reveal progress, you'll see that we now also have that orange tint right there. Oh yeah, and one last thing is I added a default shadow color constant on the top of this useGetMaterial file, because we're reusing that for both the floor shadow color and for the indirect color. And with that, we're at the end of this video. We finished the entire MatCapMaterials, FloorShadowMaterials, and the Mesh Basic materials. So we don't have to look at this anymore at all. This will be the hook that we're going to use in the folio model component, and yeah, we're just gonna get the result here, and we don't have to look at it anymore. And that's finished for now. So thanks for watching. Don't forget to like if you made it this far into the video, and I'll see you in the next one.